Welcome to the Discovery Pod, where we talk to leading experts from the University of Adelaide about solutions to society's most pressing challenges. The power of music, how technology is helping us immerse, interact and realise music's benefit. Today, I'm joined by Luke Harold, composer, performer and producer of interactive computer music, and Steve Cook, senior lecturer in media and specialist in immersive technologies. Hi, how's it going?
Hi, Andy.
Hi, Andy.
Music is a universal language. It strengthens our connection to the past and can bring people to tears. So what is it about music that makes us feel? And how is technology changing the game to allow music to be used in new ways? So Luke, why don't we start the conversation with you? Why is music so emotional for us?
Well, I think part of it, it comes back to our memories a lot of the time. And so, Bob Dylan once said that, music's the soundtrack to our lives. And if you think about, just the amount of music consumed today, most people are very familiar with that situation. They're driving their car or they're walking down the street, they've got the headphones on. In that sense, they're actually, colouring their day-to-day experience with music constantly. And this kind of, feeds into their memories. And so, at times, they'll then hear a piece of music, in the future, and will kind of, bring those emotions at that time sort of rushing back.
Mm. So, but we all have a kind of primeval connection with music. I mean, music is part of, cultures around the world. And I remember my young son, he was very little, and we played music, and he just started moving and gyrating. So it's not just memories, is it? It's something very deep within us.
Yeah, I mean, I think music's very much, part of being human, really. And there's been a lot of studies done on music and the brain in recent years that have made some pretty interesting discoveries. So, one example is that, some studies have suggested that, some babies, for example, are born with perfect pitch. And so it's part of our system that allows us to say, recognise our parents when we, before we have language. So, we're sort of interacting with them, at that very early stage of development, just through the tone of their voice. And, it sort of goes further too. There's been some evolutionary studies done, for example, which are quite interesting, which basically looked at, the kinds of chemicals released in our brains when we're listening to music. And what they found was, we get, the same kinds of chemicals released when we're listening to music as, say, chimps do when they're grooming each other, for example. So, in an evolutionary, from an evolutionary perspective, some people have looked at, well, maybe once the population of humans, kind of exceeded, living in small clans, like say chimps do, for example, we needed to find another mechanism for, having that same sense of, social cohesion that grooming gives chimps in a human population. And so, music kind of filled that void as well.
So we get that chemical rush from grooming that we get through music. So serotonin or what? So it's that cohesion hormone that music helps stimulate.
Yeah, and so in that sense, it becomes really critical towards sort of social cohesion. And as you mentioned before, it then appears in many different cultures all around the world.
Yeah. That's an interesting thought that music is essential for social cohesion. So how has music changed over the years, and how has technology started to interact with music?
So, if you look at the early days, say you went back to the early 20th century, for example, most people sort of played music because we didn't have things like records and the recorded sort of medium. So, if you were going to...
No TV.
No TV. So if you're going to consume music, you had to perform it. And so you had things like sing-alongs and so on, just as social events in people's homes.
Yeah.
But, once the recording technology developed, obviously music changed fairly dramatically, and the way that we consume music changed at that point, and sort of built up to a very mature, industry during the mid-90s, and then obviously that got disrupted by the internet. So it's sort of interesting to see the way that music's played out across that period to what we have now, which is this quite elaborate combination of things like streaming and many different kinds of tech that music sort of ends up in.
Yeah, and you've seen that change through your career as well. I mean, you're a composer. Presumably you started out with the piano or some kind of instrument, and now you've moved to embrace some of those technologies, I guess.
Yeah, so in the early days, I started out as a kind of grunge metal guitarist, which was, I had my band in the mid-90s, like everybody.
Good time for grunge bands. In
yeah,
the
yeah,
90s,
we wanted to be Kurt Cobain, right? He just kind of
Did
died.
we?
So.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you're a metal guitarist. But, and so I sort of, it's interesting, I did embrace technology very early on in my career because I saw that it seemed obvious that was where it was going to go. So, I started composing when I was doing my undergraduate studies as a composer. I was writing sort of experimental, contemporary art music, classical music. And I adopted the computer for that really early on. And it was really interesting at the time. I'd send pieces off to ensembles to perform them. And they'd say, oh, no, we want a handwritten score. We need to see the composer's soul in the score. And the computer doesn't do that for us,
Well, as you can with Mozart or Beethoven, you can see the soul of the composer through their handwritten notes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they wanted the handwritten notes.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. About 10 years later, I sent a score off to the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra to get, workshopped. And it was handwritten, and they looked at it and said, "Oh, no, we don't perform handwritten scores.
We've moved on.
We've moved on." So I thought it was really interesting
how embarrassing
how that had changed, and it was sort of funny because by that point I'd been making, basically printed, computer sheet music for 10 years, and I'd happened to the particular piece I wrote. It was quite innovative, and you couldn't really put it in the computer. So I'd done it handwritten in that instance, and they weren't interested in that. By that point, so that's sort of interesting.
And you work in the oldest music school in the country with the Elder Conservatorium. So, but the Elder Conservatorium has also embraced this technological change across its disciplines, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. The Conservatorium, it was founded in the 1880s in Adelaide, and it was in its current home in Elder Hall, that was opened in 1901. So, we do have a very long tradition of music in the Conservatorium. One thing that's interesting, a lot of people sort of associate the Conservatorium with classical music and, say, jazz performance, for example, but actually we've had our first electronic composer in residence was in 1962 in Hank Badings, and we had a practical course in music technology from 1967, which makes us the oldest electronic music unit in Australia,
right,
as well, which is sort of not necessarily something that everybody associates with the Conservatorium. In the modern era, we actually now engage with pretty much the entire music industry. So we've got programs. I'm the head of the contemporary popular music program in the Conservatorium. Train a lot of young songwriters. We've also got last year we opened up our music theatre stream as well. So. Across sort of 9 different areas of the Conservatorium, we pretty much engage the entire industry.
Mm. And how is technology affecting the business of composing? How are we seeing technology change that? If I look at my own career as a good example, like you say, I'm kind of. It's interesting in a way that my career straddles this kind of when, digital technology really took off through the 90s, and so I sort of predated that a little bit, and then sort of moved into it. So on the one hand, the way that composers are composing has changed a lot. A lot of composers will work even in, say, classical art music with a digital audio workstation to begin with, and then they'll make a score from there. But in my own research from the early 2000s, I actually branched out into sort of looking at things like assisted composition, for example, with sort of artificial intelligence and artificial life. And then ultimately looking at sort of real-time sort of interactive systems that I developed sort of through my PhD. So we sort of branched out into a lot of different areas, and we also teach things like interactive game sound and film sound and things like that as well within the Conservatorium. So that means you can program up an AI system. Input the type of sound, or you might have a jazz improv that's coming up, and you say, okay, create that. Because we've seen AI used in the art world to generate new works of art. Not my cup of tea, but it's really getting quite advanced now. So are we at the same level in music? Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, it's sort of interesting that some ideas about so if you look at, say, non-computer-based systems in sort of more automated composition systems. They've sort of mirrored the development of fields like cybernetics, for example. So you've got ideas from cybernetics originating in the 1950s, and you've got sort of musical ideas floating around that are similar to that at the same time. So it's kind of interesting that it's sort of followed, sometimes music's even been a little ahead of the science at times. And so, if you think of AI as an example, I mean, we had systems like David Cope's Emmy system in the 1987, was making new Mozart symphonies and things like that, where you could sort of feed pieces of Mozart into the system, and it would, basically what's called an augmented transition network. It basically that's normally a language tool, so it would break down Mozart's musical language and then recompose new pieces using that language. So, Cope was sort of doing that in the 80s and still continues with that research today.
Yeah, neat.
It's moved into other areas too, though, right? Like even the production level, machine learning and artificial intelligence. You can put a song into the machine and basically tell it to master your own work in a similar way. So it's moving quickly through not just the composition, but also the more tech-oriented mastering and recording style as well, I think.
Yeah. So it's really making that job a lot easier, but also coming up with some really novel context for that.
Yeah, I think there are arguments for it, that sometimes when it's overly easy, perhaps it takes some of the artistry out of it.
Yeah, that's right.
But, these are all tools to be used, and I think that's the way the technology is going.
There's a reason that grunge metal is built, made in northwest US, where it's raining all the time. You've got to suffer for your artistry, but yeah. And so, Steve, let's unpack that a bit more. I mean, what is music immersion? What's the area that you actually?
So I'm specialising in immersive technologies, and when I say the phrase immersive technologies, I'm specifically talking about virtual reality, mixed reality, and augmented reality.
Okay, so what's the difference between those?
So virtual reality...
I never know, so...
Yeah, it's... I get this question a lot.
Yeah.
So...
so imagine I'm really stupid, all right? It's not too difficult.
Okay, yeah. I'll give it my best shot. So virtual reality is being immersed in a 100% or close to 100% synthetic space. Usually 6 degrees of freedom in terms of movement, so you can walk around, you can reach out, you can grab things, but it is a synthetic world.
6 degrees of freedom.
6 degrees of freedom.
So I've got 3D, I've got some time.
So basically it's like this room, but you would walk around this room as the physical space, but that would translate to the same movement within a virtual world. And everything that you 3D, see...
3 and 3, is that...
No. It's 6 degrees, so you're locked to that's axes of movement.
Okay.
So you lift right up and down, and then in and out.
Yeah.
So this is more so what virtual reality is looking at now, purely synthetic. Mixed reality can take virtual elements and implant them in the physical world, so that they are interacting with the physical space. And a good example of that would be if I put a virtual object on this table, but there was something in front of the virtual object that would be occluded, that occlusion would be monitored and tracked. So it would look like the virtual object is behind a physical object. Augmented reality is like Pokemon Go. It's overlaying of digital information, not so much interacting with the physical space.
Yeah.
So what I'm working in is primarily 6 degrees of freedom virtual reality. And one of the projects that Luke and I are actually working on at the moment is around rehabilitation and movement with music. So if I was to explain that to someone that wasn't familiar, I would say...
Let's give it a go.
Let's give it a go. I would say that it's... you have a physical space, just like I mentioned. You can walk around that physical space.
So you actually physically walk around
Do you
have goggles on?
You have goggles on.
Yeah.
So everything you see and everything you hear is digitally created.
So goggles and earphones.
That's right, yeah.
Do you have anything on your hands? Or am I allowed to touch things in the room?
Yeah, you may be holding controllers that will monitor your hand movement.
Yeah.
So that way there's 3 points of reference. You've got your head, you've got your hands, and these are tracked at very often sub-millimetre accuracy, and over, on average about 6 by 6 metres of space. So you can walk around that virtual environment. And the project that we're working on is about music interaction within that virtual space. Pressing buttons, moving controls that aren't really there, but in the virtual world
you can see them in the virtual world.
That's right. And you can reach out and use your own hands to interact with them. You can set spatial sound in the way that sound will feel like it's coming from another location. And we've got things like synthesizers that work on true volumetric interaction as well. And what that means is that within that physical space, if you interact with a certain component, it's not, it doesn't work the same way that you'd expect something to in the real world, and that you'd be touching a button or knob or a keyboard. You are using your own physical movement to create new sound and interact with sound.
So what was that 1960s variophone or vibraphone? What was it where you put your hand over it?
Maybe the theremin you're talking about?
Maybe.
Yeah, so the theremin goes back to the 1920s.
Okay.
And then you've got things like the other instruments like ribbon controllers and things on synths which kind of emulate that, to so that you can control things. A theremin's incredibly hard to play. Yeah, you need to be quite virtuosic to.
But very
to
fun
that.
though too.
They're very fun. Yeah.
So we can.
So it is. I think what you're getting at is yes, it is a new way to interact with music. So like the theremin is very interesting because you have pitch and volume. But imagine if that pitch and volume and a whole bunch of other sounds or layers of sounds or effects or filtering characteristics were over a volume as big as a room.
Yeah.
It's that kind of interaction. You're not just locked to a machine, you can move around a whole space freely.
So you're not just you're not at the disco dancing to the music, you're in the room dancing, making the music.
That's right,
Is that the, so that sounds like a neat project, but what practical applications does that kind of technology now have?
So this particular project has been seed funded for rehabilitation and pain diversion strategy. So this is something that is going to be used in the medical space, or at least tested in the medical space. This has become, I would say, quite a hot topic recently. Music therapy is gaining a fair bit of traction. I gave a talk at a conference a medical conference on this topic, showed this particular prototype to many therapists, and all of them were very interested in having this because not only did the virtual world potentially pull patients away from clinical settings where they might feel not overly comfortable, it gave them a sense of well-being through the music, or it will give them a sense of well-being through the music.
And also with the immersion in the virtual reality, it's quite a it's quite a reassuring environment, isn't it? It's
can be.
Yeah. Depends what you're into, I guess.
Yeah, so
Depends what you put in there.
actually,
I love being in there. Maybe
that's one of the changes that we are having to make for this particular study.
Yeah.
Because the prototype we whipped up relatively quickly, and it wasn't. How can I say it? It wasn't the most calming of scenarios, I guess. Had drop-offs and things like that.
Okay.
So yeah,
you guys are really mean, aren't you?
yeah, just the way it was.
I don't know. I think you're also.
It's just the way it was. It's the way you made it.
It's the way I made it, but we weren't thinking about clinical settings at that particular time.
No.
And I like the feeling of, like, in virtual reality, for those that haven't used it, it's a very natural feeling at that top tier of virtual reality. I'm not talking about mobile phones and 360 video. That top tier of virtual reality, you can gauge distance very effectively. If you're standing on top of a building, you instinctively hold controllers tighter if you've got controllers in your hand because you're fearful of perhaps dropping them. It's a very powerful feeling. So when I built that, I wanted to elicit those sort of feelings and for a bit of fun. But now that it's moving more into a patient-oriented setting, it had to be changed. Yeah.
So it's a bit like you compose music for horror films. You create the environment for horror. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And are you guys working on this project together?
Yes.
Yeah, at the moment.
Yeah. So I guess we've both had to pull back a little bit, haven't we?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, actually, right. It's sort of interesting you talk about that because I've worked in, different type of immersive media for quite a while, building art installations, for example, and so they're more. Embedded in the real world or transforming a space that still is, taking in the audience's, all the audience's senses, but a few other different settings. And so actually in those spaces, I'm quite inspired by, horror film music and techniques. Quite often it works really well. But yeah, in this setting, no, we've had to, change our approach a little bit.
And the initial composition so when I built this prototype, the initial composition that I put in, so I do produce music and I've been doing it for a long time. And my genre of choice is a very hard electronic sound, which also didn't go over very well. So we've had to pull back on the visual aesthetics and also pull back slightly on what music's going to be in this as well. So
yeah, and really tailor it to the experience that we're looking to produce. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
And so I might just change tack a little bit. Obviously, we're still in the middle of COVID-19 and all some of the problems associated with that. But the kind of immersive technologies that you're developing, surely they're quite robust to some of the social isolation, social distancing. Have you seen a renewed interest in this type of technologies since we've been in a kind of COVID world? Yeah,
well, the interest in especially, the immersive technologies like virtual reality, it's been gaining momentum the past few years. The idea has been around for a long time, but since this resurgence where technology is finally capable, we're seeing a definite growth in interest. COVID has accelerated that to a certain degree, but it's accelerating it in, I think, the more social interaction spaces. And this is where a lot of interesting research is happening with multi-user, large, they're calling it warehouse tracking. So large warehouses that are fully tracked, not just 6 by 6 meters, but you can roam in anywhere within that space. So if you imagine 20, 30, 40, 50 people in that kind of space in different locations, but interacting together, quite powerful. So yes, we are seeing a fair bit of interest.
So it's kind of an immersive orchestra, socially distanced, of course.
Yeah, well, it's socially distanced because technically you will be in different physical locations, but you will feel like you are in the same space. And there's a lot of interesting research coming out of the US with facial tracking and real-time avatars, as an example. So the soft skills of dealing with somebody face-to-face, researchers are looking at how that can be brought into the virtual world as well. So me looking at you, I could see all your facial expressions, I could still have the eye contact. This is, I think, accelerating greatly due to things like the COVID situation.
Yeah, I mean, within the conservatorium as well, we've been exploring network performance since sort of start of last year, and so that's also sort of accelerating. So, I mean, for this year during COVID, a few people might have seen we've been streaming our lunchtime concerts in Elder Hall, for example, so people can tune in, and we've had, I think we have an audience of about 80,000, which is obviously far bigger than we can normally fit.
That's true. It's made things much more accessible.
Elder Hall, yeah, exactly. We've had an amazing response to that. So some of the research we're doing, like we've had students performing here at the conservatorium with students in California, for example, performing together, sort of streaming 8 channels of audio in both directions.
And it's quick enough to be able to do that in real time.
Yeah, and it is quick enough to do that, in real time. And we're now starting to explore at the pointier end being able to actually put, virtual reality goggles on, like Steve's talked about, and you're actually in the space at the other end. So I can actually, sort of stream 360 video and actually look around in the room where, where the performers are at the other end, and sort of offer some feedback, which is also an interesting new area of research. And I think, going forward, especially with musicians being, touring and so on, being massively interrupted, some of these things are going to become, get pushed a lot further. I mean, Childish Gambino did a performance with an inflatable dome. I don't know if you've seen that one at all, Steve.
No, I haven't.
A couple of years ago, but a lot of interest has popped up now in that performance because people have sort of gone, wow, okay, maybe, since we've had this disruption, we can leverage some of these new technologies.
So it's. I'm still waiting for Violent Femmes to come here and me to realise my tickets, but anyway, hopefully they'll come later next year. So let's pick up this theme a little bit of the future as well. So, for students out there that are thinking about coming to university or about to come to university, obviously if they come into music, they probably have some aptitude for music, have a certain instrument that they're going into. But what are the kind of new areas that you guys are looking at that students will start to interact with in 3 to 5 years' time? So what's the future horizon for this kind of music technology space?
Well, say, I think in our Sonic Arts program that we have in the Conservatorium, which is our music technology program, what we're working with at the moment is, our students get a really broad skill set, and I think that's going to be one of the keys of the future, is actually being really highly adaptable to any of the new technologies that come out, because technology, the development technology is accelerating. So it's more about learning the skills that you can kind of adapt to any technology that happens to emerge. So we sort of teach our students in the Sonic Arts program a combination of music production and sound engineering that we were talking about before. Also, computer coding and leading into things like AI and so on. And also, like game sound and film sound and things like that. So, the students coming out of those degrees have a really broad skill set that then allows them to sort of, adapt to really whatever happens and sort of specialise after that. So they might branch out.
Music scores for video games, it's not just going to play in an orchestra, it's this broad range of kind of audio interaction that the students will be equipped with.
And I think Luke's hit the nail on the head there. The skills that are obtained in a lot of our programs are very much able to be applied in other areas. So, within our immersive tech offerings as well, we're covering a whole range of skill sets that now, if we're looking at the way that movies are produced as just one example, the immersive technologies are being used as tools. The Lion King was made using VR headsets where they placed virtual cameras so that the directors could actually stand inside those digital sets. Or The Mandalorian, created with game engine technologies for their CGI. All of these skill sets that we're offering now translate into many other areas. So, from computer programming to digital art to sound engineering, all of the skills can be moved and able to be applied everywhere.
Well, great snapshot of the future and great discussion. Luke and Steve, thanks for being on Discovery Pod.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to the Discovery Pod, brought to you by the University of Adelaide. Join us next time when we discuss cybersecurity